Snow fell in needles, slow and endless, a veil between sky and earth. From the top of the wall, Jon Snow could not tell where the world ended. The night was very still, so still he could hear the faint groan and shift within the ancient ice itself, as if the wall dreamed in its own cold tongue. Ghost stood beside him, a white shadow against white stone, pink eyes drinking the dark. The direwolf's breath plumed, and Jon rested a gloved hand between his ears, feeling the hidden strength beneath the fur, the answer to a loneliness that winter sharpened into ache. He had stood so before when he was a boy playing at being a man, and after, when the boy had been burned away and only duty kept its grip, kept him still. It was the one thing that did not blow away with the snow. Below, the lamps of Castle Black were scattered stars. A column of torches moved through the yard like a slow, molten serpent, and the wind carried up the faint sound of brass, trumpets, and battered horns. Then the harsher clatter of hooves. The king had arrived. Jon watched the torches stream toward the king's tower and did not move. They would send for him when they wished to send for him. A raven had come at dusk with a square, tight hand no steward of the watch could mistake. You will attend me at moonrise. The ill courtesy of kings was a weight like any other. Come, he told Ghost and turned to the lift. The winch groaned and answered, and the cage descended as though the entire world were a rope burned by cold, shrinking in the fist of the dark. When he stepped out, the wind became something else. Noise, smoke, people, horses shaking frost from their manes, the steam of kitchens and the iron smell of the forge. The yard was crowded, banners bright even under snow, red tongues of fire stitched on black and yellow cloth, antlered stags with the red heart. Men knelt and men jostled and men shouted, and above it all Queen Celis' voice cut like a knife, sharp and thin, telling some poor steward to quit his stammering. Melisandre moved through the chaos as if it parted for her, a shimmer of warmth that was not warmth swimming about her like a mirage. Lord Commander. She dipped her head, and the ruby at her throat pulsed as if it had a heart. The king awaits. The king will keep, Jon said, but not so softly that she could not hear. Her lips curved. Snow caught in her hair and died, and he envied it. He will, it is true. Winter teaches patience, but the night teaches fear. Come. The night is yours and his both. They crossed the yard together. He felt the eyes on him and let them pass through as wind passes the wall. Men saw what they wished. A traitor to the old ways for some, a shield for others. He had learned not to drink the poison brewed in other mouths. In the tower, the air was heavy with damp wool and smoke. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder in the narrow stair, muttered prayers to burning gods and nameless ones, curses at the cold, everything human magnified by stone and winter. The hall was a blaze of rushes and light, too bright after the dark. The red banners of the queen's men washed in fire. At the far end, upon a high-backed chair that would be called a throne if it were richer, Stannis Baratheon sat like a carved thing, clenched, iron, a shape cut from purpose. Celis was at his side, mouth pinched. The girl, Shireen, peered out from behind her mother's sleeve with large eyes, and the patch of gray that marked her cheek seemed a map of some storm that had passed and left a wound. Jon knelt. He did not have to, but there were courtesies that cost nothing and blunt sharp edges. Your Grace, you kept me waiting, Stannis said without preamble. I was on the wall, Your Grace. Where else would you be? Stannis's mouth moved, something like humor pressed down until it was too thin to be seen. The wall is your kingdom. It is less than I had hoped, but we will make do. He flicked a glance at Melisandre. She inclined her head, and her red stone burned a little brighter. Rise, Lord Commander. We have work. Jon stood. We always do. Stannis's gaze flicked like a thrown knife to the men ranged along the walls. Godry Faring stood with arms crossed over his deep chest, thick beard iced and crusted. Queen's men in red cloaks rustled and stamped feet. A handful of black brothers watched from the back, their faces unreadable in the fire's shifting light. Bowen Marsh's mouth was a thin line. Clyda's, poor man, had come as if to assure himself this was happening. Stannis said, Melisandre tells me you have a gift for the impossible. It is not a gift, Jon said. Only the weight I was given. Good. Stannis' voice was iron at grinding wheel. You will use it. I march for Winterfell as soon as my scouts return. The Northmen have pricked themselves to see if they bleed. Some do. More will if a blade is held to their throats. But the North is short of blades that matter. I have men loyal to me for coin and kingship, and men loyal to their own bellies, and men loyal to their shrines. I have not enough men loyal to home. You will give them to me. The Night's Watch does not take part in the wars of the realm, Jon said. Winter had taught him to keep his voice quiet. You know this, your grace. Stannis' jaw tightened. Do not play me for a fool, Snow. I am not asking for your brothers. I am asking for the free folk. He lifted a hand to still the stir that ran through the hall, and Sellis' mouth turned up as if at some private victory. A king needs men. You have the door to more men than any lord in Westeros. Open it. You let them through your wall, you feed them, you put down your back so they might step upon it. For what? For pity? For some boy's dream of mercy? With me, they would have a purpose. With me, they would earn the land they steal a bite at a time. Jon held his gaze. Your grace, he said very evenly. The free folk are not yours to take. They are not mine either. They are people who have never knelt and call kneeling a shame. They have chieftains, not lords. They will shiver at your banners and spit at your laws. Then you will teach them to love laws, Stannis said. You will teach them to love their children's bellies full and the roofs above their heads that do not burn because Bolton men or raiders light them. You will tell them the king's peace is the only peace they will keep. They will not kneel, Jon repeated. Let them try standing against the snows, said Sellis sharply. Let them die on the wrong side of the wall, then. Better wolves eat wolves than wolves eat men. Melisandre's eyes were upon Jon, cat-slow, as if the very air between them were tinder and she a spark that watched where to take. There is another way, she said softly. A king who is only one sort of king will be a small king when the cold comes. There are kings of snow and kings of stone and kings of fire. The night will not bow. You must make a road between fires, else you will be burned in both. Stannis frowned. Speak sense. The free folk will not kneel, Jon said, before the priestess could spin more riddles. But they will make pacts. Give them truth and they will give you truth. Let them keep the names they call themselves, and they will follow you into the storm. Not as subjects, as allies. Jon heard his own heart. He had thought these words while the snow fell, turned them like a knife in his hand until they fit. Share the North with them. Share, Stannis said, and in his voice was contempt. Am I a baker with loaves? The North is mine by right. I will not cut it and hand pieces to some ragged singer who crowns himself in the woods. Jon did not flinch. You will lose it if you try to hold it like a thief holds a door with his back, your grace. You know the count of your men. You know the count of the Boltons. You know Winter. You may win a battle and another. You cannot feed castles with banners. The free folk can live where you cannot. Move in snows that swallow horses. Hunt where your granaries will be empty and your larders blind. The others will not care for your sigils. They will care whether men stand together. Share the North, your grace, not with a crown, with a sword. Stannis was very still. In that stillness lay danger, and the stubborn marrow of the man. Speak plainly, he said at last. What is it you propose? Jon drew breath. A truce made true. Let Mance raider live. The hall froze. He could feel the third thing in the room swell then narrow, eyes narrowing, lips tightening, hands quickening around hilts. The wail of wind outside seemed to creep through the stones themselves. Godry Faring's laugh was very harsh and very loud, and died very fast. Sellis looked as if she had bitten her own tongue. Madness, she breathed. He blasphemes in the king's own hall. If Mance Rayder is alive, Stannis said slowly, it is because my priestess spared him against my will. It is treason twice named. I will not suffer a false king. Melisandre's smile did not reach her eyes. The man burned was not he. You wished a sacrifice in the sight of men, and I gave you one. Smoke and song are brothers. Wind and flame are sisters. One man wore another's face, and the world was soothed by the sight of death it demanded. She lifted a hand before Stannis' rebuke could strike. I spared him at the Lord's bidding. He is a singer, and the night listens to singers. Their voices go where swords cannot. A singer, Godry sneered. Shall we flute our way to Winterfell? Jon did not let it fall to mockery. Mance Rayder knows the free folk. He is their song and their memory. If you expect them to follow your banners into a war you call theirs, they will turn their backs. If he tells them to follow, they will go. Not because he kneels, not ever, because he chooses to stand with us. Stannis' gloved hands tightened on the arms of the chair. With me, with the living, Jon said, and the words tasted of old snow. It is one line, Your Grace, but it is the only line that matters. Stannis looked at him for a long time. The flames played across his hard face. 1,000 small wars. Shireen's eyes were big, her mouth open in a small O as if all this were a story and she had forgotten to breathe. Melisandre watched the king, the ruby in her throat throbbing, redder. At last Stannis said, Where is he? A cell of ice, Melisandre said. Where we put songs when we are not yet ready to hear them. Bring him, Stannis said, and his voice was a cut. They brought him in with irons at his wrists but no bag on his head. He walked as if he were free, though he was not. Under what had been Rattleshirt's rag-and-bone war trophies, his eyes were bright and watchful. The hall stirred, as at the sight of some old tale alive, a fox that speaks, a winter that laughs. Mance's smile was quick and wry and vanished. He looked at Jon as one looks to an old campfire. He looked at Stannis as one looks at a storm. Your Grace, he said, with a bow of the head that was not a kneel. My thanks for the hospitality. My bones have never felt so welcome. You should be dead, Stannis said. I, Mance said, but I have been that before. Was not much to it. Stannis' back stiffened. Celis made a sound. Godry took a step as if to strike the man's mouth, and Melisandre's little finger lifted. The knight checked, glaring. Jon said, We are short on men who can talk to a storm, Your Grace. Mance's head turned, quick. And here I thought I was brought to watch a king cut my throat. Would you kneel for your life? Stannis asked. No mockery lived in the question, only iron. For my son's life, Mance said. It was very simple, very clean. But he is beyond the world's knowledge. The rest is song. I will not kneel, Your Grace. I do not say it out of pride. I say it out of truth. Men who follow me would spit on the ground if I did. They would call me a fraud. Worse, they would call you a fool to take such a man. I have been many foolish things. I do not reach for more. What would you reach for? Jon asked. Mance looked back to him, and for a moment there was no singer and no king and no crow and no lord commander, only two men in winter. A cliff holds, Mance said, when every hand finds a crevice. I would reach so that hands have something to hold. Jon felt ghost press against his leg, a weight he knew he would never lose so long as he drew breath. There is a cliff coming at us, he said, a cliff made of night. Melisandre's laugh was very soft. You have learned to speak my tongue. Shireen coughed, a small sound. Celis' hand pressed her arm as if to still her. Stannis said, If I spare you, you will buy me the wildlings. I will tell them it is wiser to stand by a fire than shiver in the snow, Mance said. I will tell them kings and crowns are nothing if your child does not survive the night. I will tell them we can always make fools of you after, if you live. He smiled, showing teeth. They will like that last part. I like none of it, Stannis said. But I am not here for liking. He stood. The movement ran through the hall like a scythe. Hear me. This is what I will permit. He spoke as though he hammered iron. No crown, no throne, no titles that mock what is true. You will speak for your people. They will fight when I bid them fight. They will go where I permit them to go. They will have lands south of the wall. Lands that are empty or lands I take from men who call me false. They will keep their names, if their names do not try to cut my flesh. If they raid, I will hang them. If they steal women, I will cut their hands. If they break guest right, I will break their necks. He looked to Jon. You will stand between us and bind this bargain. I will hear you on matters within your wall and without. I will give you no title you can be hanged for, and no coin you cannot account for. You will have my oath to guard your watch. In return you will throw open your gates and take in every wildling that comes. And in return, Jon said, the free folk will stand on the wall when it is dark, side by side with the black, and their dead will be burned before dawn. They will stand, Mance said, and the words were a pledge and a sorrow both. I will say it, and I will sing it, and I will go among them until the saying turns into walking. Stannis's mouth was a line. So be it, he said, as if he spat steel. We will have a pact, by sword and fire and the old trees you love, Lord Commander. We will have a pact. His eyes narrowed. Do not make me regret it. Your Grace, Jon said, and bowed his head. We will seal it, Melisandre said. There is a place older than castles. Go there. Bring your blood and your breath. The wall listens. It has been waiting. The night fort had never learned to be less than it was. Its stones remembered the dead, and the dead listened when men lifted the old iron rings and stumbled into the kitchen with the well that went down forever, and the maze beneath where the world was a root, and the root had a door of weirwood with a face carved so long ago it had learned to live. Jon let the torchlit column trail behind him and went first, ghost pacing him, fur bristling as if he knew some small part of the tale these stones told over and over. In the well chamber the cold was thick and clinging. When they came to the door, it looked out at them with blind eyes and whispered. Jon set his gloved hand upon the smooth, carved cheek. His breath misted and hung. I am the sword in the darkness, he said, and the words made the faintest echo, like a harp string touched. I am the watcher on the walls. He lifted his hand. Open. The black mouth opened upon blackness. The smell was earth and old rain and something he could not name. Stannis moved forward, Melisandre beside him, the queen's men uneasy, the black brothers silent in the way of men whose bones have learned a new fear. Mance Rayder followed without chains, his head up, a singer in a hall that had once listened to kings. Jon stood within the tunnel and felt the wall above them, a mountain that watched, a god old and asleep that might stir in its dreams. They stood upon cold stone. Melisandre held up her hand and the ruby flared. Its light was red as a heartbeat, and Jon and Stannis and Mance put their hands upon their knives. Blood, Melisandre said, not as demand but as law. All oaths begin in blood and end in ash. Stannis cut his palm without flinching. He held it up, his face like winter iron, and let the drops fall upon the stone. They hissed like snow against a hot plate, though there was no heat here that Jon could feel. Mance cut his palm and laughed under his breath. I have given blood to too many groundstones, he said. Jon cut himself last. His blood smoked as it struck the stone, and he felt the wall. Felt it like a sound older than his house, than his name, than the words men had made for fear. He felt it notice. Say it. Melisandre's voice was whisper and wind. Say what you mean. Stannis said, I will have the north and I will have it alive. Mance said, my people will live on the south side of this rock, and I will speak for them. Jon said, we will stand together against what comes. The wall listened. Jon felt that listening, then somewhere very far above them, a groan like an old tree in a storm rolled through the ice. When they came up out of the hole and winter took them back into its mouth, the night was deeper, the stars closer. The fire of torches bobbed and men breathed and whispered as if their lungs had learned new air. Mance flexed his wounded hand and looked at it as if a line had been redrawn there. Now, singer, Stannis said. Sing. Mance sang in the yard before the king's tower, with snow hissing into the brazier and Ghost sitting with head cocked and the black brothers clustered with the queen's men in an uneasy ring. His voice was not like the ones Jon had heard in the halls of Winterfell when he was a boy, and songs were something that kept the dark out of corners for a little while. Mance's voice moved like a knife carving old meat, carving away fear, carving a story from bone. He sang of mountains and the first summer where men remembered the taste of berries. He sang of the false dawn, and of waking to find the world larger than the circle of your own fire. He sang of a red king who had no songs and learned to live from a woman who did. He sang of wolves as brothers and crows as thieves, and the time a giant wept because he could not hold all the sky in his hands. By the time he finished, the yard was quiet in a new way, and the snow fell as it had always fallen, indifferent and endless. "They will come," he said simply, and Jon knew it would be so. They came as winter scatters seeds downwind. They came in ragged bands led by chieftains with hair braided with bone, by women with axes and infants bound to their backs, by old men whose eyes had gone winter pale, and by boys who had never known a summer without hunger. They came with sleds drawn by dogs and by scrawny ponies, by giants in 2s and 3s who stooped to pass beneath the gate and blinked their small eyes in the torchlight and laughed deep and loud when someone brought them mead. They came and they stared at banners and walled rooms and the braided rugs of the queen's chambers as if they were artifacts in a lost city. They came, and they looked at the Black brothers with wariness, and at the king with suspicion, and at Jon with something that made him straighten when he walked. Not love, not even trust. Recognition. At Eastwatch, Cotter Pike wrote to say he was a fool to his arse. The winds were worse than tea. He worst day he had lived, and he would shove the next free folk that spouted a prayer into the sea. At the Shadow Tower, Dennis Mallister wrote more carefully, expressing worry about provisions and order, but in each tight line Jon heard the same thing: fear fitted to duty. He answered both letters with ink and salted beef and men. Bowen Marsh came to him in the rookery, and if the old steward had ever smiled, winter had stolen the memory of it. "This is folly," Marsh said, hands folded in his wide sleeves as if to hide their trembling. "You turn the watch into the inn-yard of the world. Your brothers do not know who they guard against. Our vows are a fence, Lord Commander, and you are pulling up the posts." Jon looked at the old man and saw snow gathered in the red of his eyes. "Our vows are a sword," he said. "We are sharpening it. At what cost? Keeping them from stealing our women? Do they understand women are not spoils? Do they understand we give guest right with bread and salt rather than an axe to the tongue? Do they? We will teach them," Jon said, "and they will teach us how to live when the snows do not end. There is much the watch has forgotten because we thought the wall kept secrets. It only kept us from hearing." Bowen's mouth pinched. "You are not the first boy to think himself a man who would change the world. We bury those boys with honor and forget them with haste." Jon took a breath and let it go. "You may call me boy when you have stood where I have stood and done what I have done. Until then, call me Lord Commander, and bring me the ledgers. If we are to feed the world, we will do it with our eyes open." They fed the world as far as their hands reached. Boiled barley and stringy salt pork and onions with the rot cut out, and bread when the ovens could keep pace and the flour was not all weevil. They found roofs that did not leak and replaced those that did. They built fires in every place a man could huddle. They lost children in the crush and found them in the straw of the stables and the corners of the cellars. They burned their dead at dawn, when the snow glowed like milk and the sparks blew away like a swarm of summer midges that no one alive remembered except in dream. They hung a man on the third day for breaking guest right, and Jon did it himself. The hall watched, free folk and black, and learned something both had always known. He slept when he could, which was rarely, and ate when he remembered, which was less. When the raven came from Eastwatch with 3 words in Cotter Pike's angry scrawl: "Hard home, help, dead," Jon felt the words like hands on his throat. He gathered his captains. Stannis sat at his head, jaw set, a map of the coast pinned to the table with knives. Melisandre stood at the hearth as if she warmed it with her gaze. Mance, without chains, leaned back in his chair, and Tormund Giantsbane drank and thumped the table and shouted for more details in a voice that could have toppled towers. The queen's men glowered. The Black brothers kept their eyes down. "Hard home is a death," Godry Faring growled. "Let it be. We are not fishers of the damned." "They are not damned," Jon said. "They are people. They are dead," Godry said. "Or they will be by the time you arrive, and then you will join them." Mance looked at the map. "Hardhome is a trap if you cannot sail," he said, in his quiet singer's way, as if he spoke only to the ink. "It is a bowl. The cliffs hold you, the sea holds you. What you bring in you must bring out over the same narrow ground. If something larger than men fills the bowl, you are a song that was half-written and cannot be finished." Tormund snorted. "Ha! Hear him make doom sound like a lullaby. Hardhome is fish. Hardhome is firewood. Hardhome is women who laugh. Hardhome is ghosts." "You left it for a reason," Jon said. Tormund said, without shame. "I left it for a reason." "We cannot leave them," Jon said. Stannis' face did not change. "We can and we will if the cost is my crown. I cannot give you knights to rescue strangers in a blizzard while the Boltons fortify with every hour." "They are not strangers," Jon said. He touched the place on the map with a finger. The parchment rustled as if another layer of wind moved beneath it. "They will be the men who hold your left when you ride against Winterfell, your grace. They will be the women who nurse your wounded when you push the Freys into the snow and call it victory. They will be the boys who grow into men who do not forget they were saved. If we abandon them, we will abandon the part of ourselves that can still win." Stannis' eyes slashed to Melisandre. "In your fires? In your marrow," she said. "The boy speaks like a king when the snow bites his tongue. Give him ships. Give him men who do not think only of their own skins. Give him a singer for the dead he will step over." The king stared at the flames as if he might count each tongue. Then he nodded once, hard. "Cotter Pike has his men. We will send a handful of my best with a handful of your best and as many free folk as choose to go. I will not strip my army for your folly." His eyes found Jon again. "If you die at Hardhome, die quickly. Do not make a ballad of it and expect me to listen." "I cannot sing," Jon said. "Mance can," Stannis said, and there was something like contempt and something like belief in it both. "And will." They went east, as men go into a storm that has already taken their names. The sea was black glass cracked with ice. The deck pitched beneath them like a living thing that did not care. Jon stood wrapped in furs and oilcloth with the salt burning his lips and the cold punishing his lungs and wondered if men had ever been foolish enough as a kind to do anything else but this. To look where the world told them do not and go where it told them you cannot. Hardhome rose white from the sea, a crescent of broken teeth. Smoke hung in the bowl like old breath. And there were people, a scatter of dark motion against snow, runnels of men and women piled against the makeshift palisades, the air full of a sound like bees, the hum of fear. The first arrows came from rocks, fletched in bone, free folk shooting at anything that moved with a fear that had turned and bit its own tail. The pennants of Stannis' knights whipped as they swore and crouched beneath shields, and their galleys scraped keel against ice with a noise that woke nightmares. And then there were wights, pale and stiff, eyes burnt blue, moving through the smoke with the certainty of water finding low ground. "Burn them," Jon shouted, and the word was a prayer and an order and a plea. Burn them. They burned what they could burn. Fire took slow in that cold, and oil turned sluggish as grief. The first line of dead pushed into the surf as if to baptize themselves again, and rose black and dripping and full of murder. Tormund had his sons with him and hewed with an axe that would have cut an oak, talking to it in a steady growl as if it were a wife who had woken fearful. Godry Faring swung a sword that rang on frozen rib and skull like a bell tolling. Mance had a bow in hand and his song was his breath. Out and in, each arrow finding a place to call home that no one living wished to call home. Jon fought with Longclaw, and the Valyrian steel felt like a thing that remembered, a thing that had been forged to drink this cold. It parted white flesh the way light parts night, which was to say imperfectly and not enough. He moved only enough to stay alive. Ghost was at his side in a froth of white, and for a time Jon could no longer tell the difference between snow and hair and smoke and the ghosts of men. He cut down again in order to let the living through. He saw an old woman with a child in each arm try to climb a ladder that had iced over. She fell, and the child tucked under her cloak did not cry as a wight seized the hem. Jon cut down and slammed his shoulder in, and someone else pushed, and the old woman went up, and for a little while that was enough of a world. They held a ring around the palisade. They pushed the living through gates and over walls and turned their own bodies into walls when the wood gave, and the hands that pulled at them were hands that had once held apples and turned the pages of books. When night fell, they were still there, and the dead did not tire, and the sea cracked inside as if some god beneath it were restless. Jon saw them on the ridge, not men. The others stood thin as wind and pale as glass and bright as the inside of a glacier when you hold a torch against it. They watched. That was worse than their coming. Jon thought then, clearly you will not be enough. Mance's voice came close to his ear. "Harp the fire," he said, and Jon nodded. Because when a king without a crown tells you to sing your blade, you find the melody. They set great wreaths of oil and pitch alight and pushed them downhill, dragging like sledges. They burned their own dead where they fell with voices breaking and eyes streaming. And in that reek of cooked winter and spoiled flesh the others stepped away, as if they had never been there. Jon did not trust the relief that ran through the line, but he took it. He would take any hand that held out. By first light, they had moved half the souls trapped in Hardhome down to the galleys. By midday, a wind came northeast, knives in it. By dusk, the first ship that had gone out cracked its keel against a floe and listed, and men screamed in a way that no story would hold. Jon counted himself as a fool for every life he had ever thought he might touch. At night, the horns called from the other side of the bowl, and the whites came again, and they fought and fought, and fought until Jon's arms were iron and he had forgotten the taste of any food that was not snow. On the third day, Cotter Pike's last galley slid in with her oars red to the leather and her men white-eyed and mute. They filled her until she dipped, until she squealed, until the men on the planks looked as if they would leap into the sea to escape the weight of other lives. And then they pulled away with a noise like a groan in a sick man's throat. Jon watched them go and thought, the world is a bowl, and every drop we carry matters, and every drop we spill is a wound. They could not save them all. He made himself look into the face of everyone they could not reach. He made himself remember how many times he had been on the other side of some door and had it closed, and he took that into his bones and set it there as a fire he would never permit to go out. On the fourth morning, with the others high on the ridge and the dead thick as flies below, Mance Raider laughed. Jon could not believe it. He turned on him, fury like heat in his frozen mouth. "Laugh," he said, "and I will." But Mance was not laughing at the dead. He was laughing at the sky. A gray shape moved high and south, slow and sinuous and black against the clouds. It was no dragon. It was no hope. It was only the smoke of a shipwreck rising in some odd current. Mance's laugh was at the smallness of things. Jon felt something break in him in a way that did not mean ruin. It meant space for something else to grow. "We must go," he said. He did not say what men say when they leave others to die, because truth was a weight too heavy to carry if you could not bend your knee under it. "Tormund, I am not deaf," Tormund said, and he put his big hand on Jon's shoulder and squeezed. "We do what men do, and then we die like men when we must. Go." They went. They held a line to the water and burned it behind them and loaded the last boats until Jon thought the sea would capsize under the insult. He was the last to step aboard, and the oar that pulled the galley away from the beach was as heavy as a sword you had promised never to lift again. They came back to Eastwatch more dead than alive, and the men who met them were the same. Jon's hands shook as he drank hot wine that seared and did not warm. When he slept, he dreamed of faces moving through smoke and woke with salt on his tongue that was not wine. It was snowing when the Raven arrived at Castle Black carrying a letter sealed with pink wax pressed with a flayed man. Jon turned it in his hands without opening. He knew. A sickness all its own seemed to live inside the parchment. He read it in his solar with Ghost at his feet and Clydas pretending not to see his face become stone. He read every word and tasted Ramsay Bolton's breath in them and set the letter down and did not touch the table for fear he would break it. Stannis was not dead. Jon knew that. Stannis was at Castle Black, and Ramsay's lies were smoke. Yet the letter sang of Abel and spearwives and a maid dragged back by hair and a singer torn to bones. It listed names and threats in the easy hand of a man who had never been caught and punished as a boy and learned that doing does not erase being. "Send for the king," Jon said, and Clydas bowed and went. He did not have to wait long. Stannis came as he came to all things and took up the letter and read it and did not blink. Celis wanted to be present, but Jon had barred the door, and if it angered Stannis to have a Lord Commander keep his queen out of a room, he did not show it. Melisandre stood near the hearth and watched Jon the way a cat watches a bird that does not know it is in a snare. "Winterfell," Stannis said. The word carried more iron than any sentence might when followed by 1,000 clever phrases. "It is bait," Jon said, "a kind that takes in men who would ride to their deaths for words on rough paper." Stannis's lip curled. "I do not ride to my death for words. I ride for crowns. But not today. We have work." "We have some of their work as well," Jon said. He lifted his head. "Night gathers, your grace. We have held it off with our hands and our breath. If we leave now, if we empty the wall for your banners, winter will pour through and we will deserve everything that follows." Stannis looked at him as a man looks at a rock he must lift. Then he set the letter down with care. "I am not emptying your wall. I never meant to. I will take brigands and thieves if they can sit a horse and swing a sword without chopping their own legs. I will not strip your posts, but I go." He tapped the letter. "I go because he wrote this. He thinks I am dead. He thinks I am afraid. I am neither." "Then wait for more men," Jon said. "Wait until you can make the trap, not be caught in one." Stannis did not smile. "You are the first man I have met who has tried to teach me how to win a war and did not stammer. I will take your counsel." He looked to Melisandre. "And yours." "In my fires," she said. "I see snow and gray trees and a lake with a skin as thin as a lie. There are men who march on that lake and it breaks and some men go through. Cannot see which. But there is a banner that falls very beautifully. There is a song about it, but it is not kind." Stannis's nostrils flared. "Fires are fools like men." But the corner of his mouth tightened. "A lake," he said. "Very well." Jon went that night to the Shield Hall and spoke the names of men and women he had seen at Hardhome, and no one answered. Because men are not gods and names do not call back the dead. He spoke anyway. When he left, the hall was empty but for a man in the back who had not been there when Jon came in. Mance sat with his back to the wall and his eyes closed, and in the light of the hearth his face looked older than stone. "I read the letter you did not show me," he said. Jon was not surprised. "You mean the letter that says you are dead and gutted and hung up in a gatehouse? The letter that sends your head to me in a sack?" He made himself smile. "You look better than your paper." Mance did not open his eyes. "The girl must be taken from Winterfell," he said. "She never learned to pretend well enough, and she has learned to be afraid too well. In that house, fear is a dog they feed meat." "I know," Jon said quietly, "and I know what you will say next. Let me go back." Jon closed his eyes and saw again the ridge at Hardhome, the pale watchers, the line they had made with their bodies, and the men who had made it into boats as if the sea were a stage. When he opened them, Mance was watching him. "I will not tell you to kneel," Jon said. "I will not tell you to beg Stannis to let you ride with him. I will tell you to take 6 women who can play at mummers and knives and a singer's suit, and go where a singer is always welcome. And when you can, bring her out. If you cannot, bring out the truth." Mance smiled very slow. "You learn fast for a crow." "I had a patient teacher," Jon said. Mance laughed once. "I sang you to sleep when you were a boy and did not know it, Winterfell's bastard. Now listen to a lullaby for men." He leaned forward, forearms on knees. "You made a road between fires. Do not be surprised to find both sides wish to walk it and meet in the middle. Stannis wants my head. The Queen wants my head on a spike. Your brothers want my head because they cannot admit the world has turned. The Boltons want my head because they want everyone's head. And the things in the snow want all our heads. There is only one way to keep your neck. Look forward and do not blink." "I have not blinked in years," Jon said, and some part of him knew it was true. In 2 days' time Stannis rode from Castle Black, banners snapping, horses blowing steam, men bundled to eyebrows, the queen's men making small fires at every halt to sing at and read omens from. He left Celis and Shireen and the queen's household at the wall, and Melisandre smiled and said she had fires of her own to tend. Jon watched them go from the top of the wall and did not feel triumph. He felt only the space where their absence made the wind sound different. He sent Tormund and 100 free folk with them, and the 100 were not enough by any calculation, but they were a promise made real. He watched the little line become little and then become a trail and then nothing under the snow. When the word came back from the Bar Rolands, it came on the slow hooves of a man with frost in his beard and the look in his eye of someone who had seen truth that left marks. Stannis had not gone to Winterfell. He had gone to a village on the edge of a lake, and there he had made a trap. The Freys had rushed, laughing, banners bright and blades bright and horses proud, as if their brains were too small to know ice is not stone. The lake had taken them. Some had shot arrows into the white as if a lake might bleed. Most had screamed. The banners fell, and the song that would be made would be cruel and not kind, just as Melisandre had promised. The king had carved the Northmen down to size on the margins. 2, taken Alice Karstark's betrayers, hanged the worst, given the others a choice. A raven came and perched atop a tower like a punctuation mark on a sentence Jon had not known could be written this way. Stannis was alive and had winter for a shield. Winter is a sword if you know where to put the point. Before that victory was done echoing, a boy with hair like straw tugged at Jon's sleeve in the yard. "A man in gray," he whispered, eyes huge, "says he saw a wolf with a burnt boy on its back. Children carve prophecy into sticks and throw them into fire for joy." Jon patted the boy's shoulder and sent someone to see. The man in gray had already gone by the time Tormund got there. Jon took it for what it was, the North telling jokes. Mance Rayder slipped on a harp as easily as another man might slip on a glove. He went into Winterfell through the kitchens, disguised as heat and laughter, and Jon Could not sleep for 3 nights knowing he had sent a man to a place he would probably not come out of. When sleep finally took him, it was thin as paper. He woke on the 4th night to shouting in the yard. He went down with Ghost at his heel and found a blade of cold so sharp it made the world taste clean. In the midst of it, a giant sat in the snow like a hill that had learned to sit. One weg one dar one cradled something in his broken hands and rocked back and forth, and men surrounded him but did not touch him, because they could not and because sadness poured from the giant the way blood pours from a man who has been cut very precisely. "What is it?" Jon asked, wearily. Tormund's face had lost some of its red and turned gray in its beard. "He found a dead child in the midden," he said. "Why was a child in the midden?" Jon asked, though he did not need to hear the answer to feel an anger that rose like steam. "Because men wrapped their fear in laws and threw the child away from the fire," Melisandre said, appearing at his elbow without sound or breath, as if the flames moved aside when she wished to be somewhere. "Because kings are slow and queens are stupid and the Lord of Light has his own business." She looked at Jon with something in her eyes he was not ready to name. "Because winter is a book, and every page is the same." Jon took off his glove and reached to touch one's big knuckle. The hair lay singed across the skin and the nails were dark with muck and blood. The giant's eyes lifted slowly and fixed on Jon, and he stilled his rocking. Jon nodded once, as if sealing some oath. "We bury our dead in fire," he said. "All our dead. I am sorry." One made a sound like a mountain shifting. When they burned the small wrapped thing at dawn, the giant stood so close the hair singed on his chest and did not move. The watch stood with the free folk, and no man spoke. The day after, the Spearwives came. They came with Jane Poole in their midst, and she was peeled and bloodless and did not recognize her own hands when she held them up. Mance was with them, limp and bleeding, and 2 men carried him as if he were a song cut in half and could not quite be put back together. They had come in under a white flag held up by a girl who laughed at axe blades as if they were jokes and a song at her hip. "The South is a pit," the largest of the women announced in the yard, "and it stinks. Here is the girl the flayed man married to a name. We stole her back from his bedding. There is a singer here who thinks he is bigger than his blood." She looked at Jon. I will spit on your floor if you do not feed me. Spit and be fed, Jon said. He took the girl gently, and she flinched and screamed without sound, and he lifted her like a thing that could be snapped and handed her to Clydas with a look that said, "You will hold her and not break what is left." Mance stirred, coughing. He opened one eye and smiled, and blood bubbled between his teeth. "I told you I would bring you the truth," he said. "You brought me more," Jon said, and did not quite smile because men were already weeping, quietly, in corners, as if they had been waiting for a reason to remember they could. The camp breathed a different breath after that. Men who had looked at Jon with fear and anger looked at him with anger and respect. Those who had muttered about guest right and thieves of women found their words sour and spat them into the snow out of habit. But their mouths were less certain. "You do not let your world be empty," Tormund told Jon, clapping his back so hard he staggered. "That is why we follow you. We can fill empty places with many things: song, drink, lies, women, men. We never filled them with honor. Honor was for kneelers. You show me it can warm your hands. Maybe I will try it." "You are drunk," Jon said. "I am always drunk," Tormund said, delighted. Then his face sobered. "Watch yourself. There are men who hate the heat you bring worse than they hate the cold. Cold is simple. Heat asks for work." Bowen Marsh came to him once more, late, with the air of a man who had decided something. "You turn our vows into bridges for strangers," he said. "We are the bridge," Jon said. "We always were. We forgot that and painted pictures on our posts and prayed to them and called it duty." Bowen's cheeks mottled. He lifted his hand, let it fall. "You will get men killed." "I already have," Jon said. Bowen left, and the snow closed around his boots with the soft little sound it made when all the rest of the world was asleep. Stannis sent a raven from the crofters' village, the letters cramped with cold. He had won a victory that would become a song men would sing when there were again summers enough for songs. He had taken hostages, made examples, set the Karstark girl free from the trap of her uncle and given her to the Magnar of Then, and thus made a little bridge of his own. He had not yet taken Winterfell. Jon sent back congratulations and nobody to spare. Queen Celis demanded audience and was told she could have it when the bread was baked. Melisandre dreamed and smiled that smile that meant she had seen a candle in the dark and could not be sure whose hand had lit it. She said too often the word king, and Jon left the hall when she did, because his marrow told him that the word did not belong to Stannis alone, and he had lived too long with his own hungers to trust his marrow blindly. That evening, as the wind clawed at shutters, Jon stood in the yard and watched one stand motionless before the pyre of the child in the midden, as if some part of him were still there, still warming his hands by a small fire in a world that wanted to keep all the fires to itself. Ghost pressed his head against Jon's thigh. The direwolf's eyes were old coins, and Jon felt the weight of all the coins men had ever put on their dead. He turned and found Mance leaning in the arch of a doorway, stitched and bandaged and pale as linen. "You should be lying down," Jon said. "I am lying down," Mance said, "just in a different direction." He looked up at the giant. "That one will break the gate if he is not handled right." "He will not," Jon said. "He will if a knight puts a sword in his chest because he does not bow fast enough," Mance said, not unkindly. "You are a bridge, boy. Remember that bridges need to be mended wherever men walk across them." "I will remember," Jon said. "You will forget," Mance said, "and then remember again. That is what remembering is." He shifted and hissed. "How does one become Lord Commander of a wall that is more alive than half the men he knows?" "By losing everything that is not the wall," Jon said. Mance smirked. "By the end of the tale you will have the world's saddest harp." He paused, and something like pity moved across his face. "I had a child with a woman I loved in a tent while the sky tried to make us its story. She died. The child lived, and then you sent him south with another woman to save him from the fire. You will never know a story like the one inside me when I think of that. So I will tell you this story instead. There is a man who thinks he must be made of ice because the place that keeps letting him live is made of ice. He is wrong. He is made of something that burns and does not consume itself. Be careful with that." Jon did not answer. He had no songs for that. He watched the giant and the smoke and thought of Winterfell's godswood, where the bark wept as if trees felt grief and had learned to show it so men might learn from them. The attack came when truths were still soft. It began with a man with a snow-wet beard stepping close in the yard as Jon turned toward the hall. "For the watch," the man said, and there was a knife. It was quick. It was clumsy. It was done by men who had loved simpler nights and wished to live in one again. Ghost leapt. The man went down. Another came at Jon's back and Tormund's hand seized his arm and spun him. The knife skittered over the leather and bit at his ribs and did not go deep. Another man shouted and another, and then the yard was a boil of men who wanted their world to stop changing and men who wanted it to survive. Bowen Marsh appeared, face pained, as if he had walked into his own old age and could not quite believe it. "For the watch," Bowen said too, and he raised a hand, and in it was no knife, only empty air. The look on his face was a thing Jon would never forget. It was the look of a man who had believed all his life that the simplest words would save him and had found them orphaned. "Enough," Jon said, and the sound of his voice carried the way a horn carries in fog. It cut through and made a tunnel, and men stopped within it for a heartbeat. Then one roared. The giant came into the yard, parting men like grass, and swatted at the air with his big hands and bellowed until heads rang. He did not strike anyone, but the shout pushed the knives back into the scabbards they had leapt from. Jon stood, blood warm under his shirt like a small truth, and let the giant's voice fill the spaces in men that could not listen to his. "Go," Jon said to the men with knives. "Go and think. Then come back. We will speak. And if you try to cut me again, you had better aim better." They went, muttering, shame and relief crossing their faces like uneven clouds. Bowen Marsh stood, then turned, then walked away, carrying his years and his guilt as if the two were the same weight. Tormund growled, "We should hang them and be done." "We will not be done if we do," Jon said. He swayed and set his hand upon Ghost's back until the world steadied. "We will be done when none of us can lift a sword. That is when the dead will teach us what mercy we skipped." He was fevered for 2 days, a small fever compared to the world's, and on the third he woke to snow falling as it had fallen on the first day, on the day he was born, on the day he would die. Melisandre sat in the chair by his bed, her hands folded on her red silk, eyes watching. "You will live," she said, and it sounded like a promise made to someone else first. "I did not ask," Jon said. "Men never do," she said, and there was a softness to the words that made him look at her twice. "The king asks many things. This was not one. You return what I gave you in the way you use it. That is all the reward I care to have." "I did not return your god," Jon said. "No," she said, and her smile was tired. "You returned fire where it was needed. Call it what you like." In the weeks that followed, peace, if one could call it that when it had so many knives hidden within it, settled like a layer of new snow over old dirt. Men came to the yard and looked at one another with suspicion and found nothing to do with it. The free folk learned to stand in a line to receive bread and not a blow, and learned that blows came anyway if they forgot the lines. The watch learned that men who had never bent their necks could still bend their knees to tie a child's shoe. The queen's men learned they could not make the world burn as fast as their prayers wished. The king sent word of another victory, small. A skirmish along a drift where the wind had carved a knife edge and men had fallen off it into death as if gravity were a lord with a writ. The lake remained. Winterfell remained. Then came Wyman Manderly's letter, large as the man, greasy with grease as if he had used pastry for ink. He wrote of ships and swords and debts owed to wolves, not salted men. He wrote names that tasted of home to Jon, names that were boys laughing in a yard and men with snow in their beards and women who kept hall like queens because their queens were dead. He wrote that the North had a memory and a belly both, and both had been stirred by the scent of flayed skin. Jon sent the letter to Stannis with a line across the bottom. "There are men who will have you for what you are when you prove it, and men who will have you for what they fear when you fail. Choose the first with each step, and you will have the second when needed beside you rather than behind you." He thought that was clever when he wrote it, and less so when he slept and dreamed of Hardhome again. He did not go south. He did not march. He sent men where he could and food where he must. He sat in his solar and read ledger after ledger, even when numbers made ants of themselves and crawled across the page. He read names and wrote them and understood that survival is a story we tell ourselves until it becomes true. The day came when the king came back. Stannis rode into the yard with a horse that looked as if it had learned to hate him and love him in equal measure, which made it look much like every man around him. He was leaner, as if winter had stripped him down to the blade he had always believed himself to be. Men rode ragged, banners torn, and the rattle of the train sounded like bones in a sack. Queen Celis came down the steps with a flurry of whispers and held her arms as if she would embrace a man who did not understand what arms were for. Shireen followed, eyes still bright. Melisandre stood in the yard, not wrapped against the cold, and looked at the king as if he were a new flame she had not expected. Jon moved forward and bowed his head. "Your Grace." Stannis slid off the horse as if the horse were a throne he had simply grown tired of. "Snow." He looked around. "Your yard looks less like a sty." "I prefer it this way," Jon said. The corner of Stannis's mouth twitched. "We took some Karstarks to rope and some Freys to holes too small for their bellies," Stannis said. "We lit the trees with their banners and watched the crows come. We are not done, but we made a beginning of unmaking." "Winterfell?" Jon asked. "Winterfell remains a stone," Stannis said. "Stones can be pulled down, but I do not have the hands. Yet." His eyes went to one, the giant standing in the yard watching a sparrow hop in a circle as if the bird were telling him a joke. "Perhaps I have one big hand, but the rest will come from men who do not like me yet." "They will like you after," Melisandre said. "Kings are like the sun. Men curse them when they are in their eyes and freeze when they are gone." "Poetry," Stannis said. He did not mean it as praise. "We made a pact," Jon said. "You kept yours." "For now," Stannis said. He looked at Mance, who stood near the door with his hands folded and his face very still. "And you kept yours." "I sang until my throat bled," Mance said. "The rest was walking." "You stink of kitchens," Stannis said. "That is where the truth lives," Mance said, easy. "See that it stinks of my truth and not only your own," Stannis said. "We will take Winterfell. We will then decide what to call the North when it is ours." "We have already called it living," Jon said. The king's face turned to iron again, and for a moment Jon thought he had overstepped. Then Stannis nodded once. "We have," he allowed. "Do not make me regret it." The winter that settled then was a winter of small things. Of a woman who had learned to make broth with too much water and just enough fat to make a mouth forget. Of a boy who discovered he could sharpen a knife better than his father had. Of a man who had hated kneelers and now sat beside one on a bench and shared a skin of thin ale, and spoke of girls whose hair smelled of smoke, and did not think to spit. Of a queen who learned that rules bent so that the world would not break. Of a priestess who prayed and burned and looked into the eyes of a man who would never be her king and saw that the fire was not hers alone. News came down the king's road like old bones rattling in a satchel. Men rose in the bar rollins and then lay down. Men died under white suns and black trees. The Dreadfort sent men, and most went home colder than they had left. The girls of Bear Island wrote letters that made grown men blush and sharpen their spears and remember their mothers. The umbers split like firewood, half for one hearth and half for another, and in that split lay the truth of the whole North. And always the others watched. Men saw them in the corner of the eye and pretended to see only snow. Sometimes a band of rangers went out and did not come back, and when the wind came from their direction, it tasted of iron and old grief. Sometimes a spear in the rack froze to the hand that dared take it. Sometimes a child laughed and the laughter sounded like glass breaking. Then it would pass, and men would blink and blow on their hands and go back to sharpening. Spring was a word with warmth in it, and men took it between their teeth and chewed and found only cold. Then, for 2 days, rain fell thin, hesitant, and a man dared say the word aloud in the yard and was knocked down by 3 others and beaten with open hands. After that, no one said the word for a week and a half. The rain stopped. The snow returned, amused. In the end, Winterfell fell to neither song nor steel alone. It fell to hunger, to hate, to the way the North remembers. Men lit fires in their own souls and burned what they had held sacred and called it justice. Men who had never bent knelt to a memory and rose with knives. A fry was found floating face down in a watering trough, and no one had filled the trough in days. Someone baked something heavy as a declaration and fed it to laughing men who stopped laughing. When Stannis finally drove his line into their line, the two lines broke as a frozen river breaks in thaw. There was fighting in the yard where Jon had learned to pull wooden swords from racks and pretend he could be a man. There was blood on the Godswood's roots, and it did not look wrong. He did not ride there. He did not break his oath. He stood on the wall with Ghost and watched the North not with his eyes but with the knowledge of every raven that had ever come from there with broken news. He put his hand against the ice and felt it settle into the deep old listening that had always been its true strength. When the raven finally came and brought one line, Winterfell ours, the breath that left him was not victory. It was only relief large enough to make a man weak. He put the bird back in its cage with hands that did not shake, and for a little while he let himself be the boy who had stood under leafless boughs and listened to his father speak of justice and wolves. Stannis came back a month later with a frostbitten army and a face that had learned that victory was a word made of stones. He held Winterfell, and Winterfell held him. He sent men to the dread fort and said little when they did not all return. He sent men to Carhold with Alice and Sigorn and learned that sometimes giving a house back its heart is better than breaking its back. He came to the night fort once more. They went below and bled on the stone and spoke no grand oaths. They only said, "We will stand," and the wall listened. Mance stood in the shadows and watched with the look of a man who had never had a house and did not envy those who did because he had learned to sing in the rain. He laughed when he came out into the daylight and the snow took him in its arms. "What is it?" Jon asked, too tired to smile. "Nothing," Mance said. "Only that we are alive long enough for this to become hilarious." "What is hilarious?" Stannis asked, mild as a sword pressed to a throat. "That we share the North," Mance said. "And the North shares us." Stannis scowled. "The North is mine," he said. "The North is ours," Jon said, and did not mean kingship. He meant breath. He meant the way a man's face lifts in firelight. He meant the way the wall groaned sometimes at night as if something old and heavy turned over eye. And its sleep. "Do not learn to like your own words too much," Stannis said. "I have never liked them," Jon said. "Good," Stannis said and mounted his horse. The days went slowly. The nights went slower. There were fewer raids, more patrols. Men were buried and burned and married and sworn. A child with hair like straw became a boy with a knife and a look in his eye that said he wished to learn what it was to be a man and feared learning the wrong lesson. A woman from beyond the wall delivered a breech babe in the king's tower and swore she would name him Jon for luck, and then changed her mind and named him after a tree. Ghost grew thicker in the chest and learned to walk the ramparts by himself. Jon woke sometimes in the middle of the night to the knowledge that the dire wolf was staring at the woods where no eyes stared back and did not worry as much as he should have. The others still watched. They came once as a testing. They came to a small tower east of the Shadow Tower where 5 men had been posted because 5 was the number in the ledger and the ledger did not know fear. They were burned before dawn because men had learned. When Jon read the names, he found one he had once told to fetch kindling, and for a moment he could not see the parchment. Then he breathed and saw again. He sent for Tormund and Mance, and together they took 15 men and went to that tower and stood there all night, and nothing came. Jon stood on the roof with Ghost, and the cold went through him all the way to that place where a boy had once believed summer was a promise kings might keep. He stayed until the sun came up and found his face stiff with ice. Then he smiled, which hurt, and went back to his wall. They built something called the Frost Council, though Jon had not called it that. Men called things. He only kept them true. It was a table in the shield hall with a wide crack in it that had been there longer than most remembered, and around it sat Stannis when he was in residence, and Mance when he was not out singing men into battle or out of knives, and Jon always. They argued as men argue, They struck the table as men do. They stood to leave and then sat again. They planned, they counted, they swore, they laughed rarely and slept less. They decided where the free folk would settle, along the long lake where wood was plenty and deer still moved, in the empty farms on the new gift that no lord had cared to count. They chose a day to bury a feud between two houses, one north and one free, and planted a tree on the spot. They sent men to Skagos because a man with his finger in the pie at White Harbor had written that a wolf child might yet cling to rocks there, and when Davos did not return at once they did not panic, because the world was slow and pain was always quick. They sent food and faith in equal measure because both were cheap until they were not. On a night that had more stars than cloud, Jon went alone to the Godswood just beyond the end of the long ditch that men had cut to channel melt. He stood by a scrubby weirwood, thin as a thieving girl, and put his hand flat to the face a long dead man had carved there. He did not ask for anything. He only stood, and he thought of Winterfell's Godswood, where the heart tree had stood too close and too large and too full of old voices he had not known he was hearing until he left it. He stood and the wind moved, and he did not dream, but he felt as if he had woken from a dream of his own self in which he had been someone else entirely. "Do you pray?" Melisandre asked from behind him. "I listen," Jon said. "Listening is prayer," she said. "Most men swear because they cannot listen." He half smiled. "You will make a lawler of me yet." "No," she said, surprising him. "I will make you Jon Snow." "And what is that?" he asked, a boy for a heartbeat, irresistible to himself. "Fire that remembers it is snow," she said. He left her there and went up to the wall and stood and watched the night until the first white line of dawn made the world something else. When summer finally did come, it did not come with trumpets or banners. It came as a single day in which snow did not fall and a bird sang somewhere, sharply twice. Men laughed at it and clapped each other's shoulders and walked around in their shirts as if they were kings. Then a cloud moved and the temperature dropped and the laughter was a ghost. Jon did not laugh. He felt a long patience inside him shift slightly and settle. Years would pass, he knew, before men would tell this tale with certainty and call it a victory. There would be more fights at lakes that looked solid and were not. There would be more children born in winter and named for trees and wolves and women who had not been queens. There would be letters from White Harbor that smelled of grease and secrets. There would be Boltons to hang and Manderleys to toast and Umbers to unsplit and bears to unleash on men who had forgotten how small they were in the face of women who knew. There would be food to ration and roads to mend and vows to keep. There would be nights when the others came down from their high halls and the fires would be almost not enough. And Jon would think of the day he had put his hand on the door below the night fort and felt the wall listen, and he would speak to it and it would hear. But for now there was snow and men who shared it. For now there was a king who was learning what it meant to be a king in a land that did not forgive pageantry. For now there was a singer who had put down his crown and kept his songs and saved more lives than the number of bones he had counted in haunted places. For now there was a boy who had become a man and had not noticed it until the moment he stopped needing to notice. He stood at the top of the wall and the wind was not cruel, only old and present. Ghost leaned against his leg and the pressure was the oldest truth he knew. He raised a hand to the east and then to the west and then to the south and then to the north, and that was not a prayer either, simply a reckoning. "Share," he said, into the wind. For the word had turned in his hands and fit now. It had sharp edges, but he had learned to hold it. The wall did not answer. It only held, as it always had, as it always would, until the day when men would no longer weigh it down with their fears and their courage. Below, in the yard, Mance tapped a rhythm upon the back of his harp and Stannis argued with a potter over whether clay owed duty to the hand that shaped it. Melisandre watched a candle and smiled. A smile that accepted that fire is not a thing men own. Tormund laughed and demanded more sausages. The free folk stood with the Black Brothers and compared the scars winter had left on their hands. A raven lifted and came down again because even birds can be wise. Jon closed his eyes and opened them. Snow fell, but the air did not taste only of ice. It tasted of smoke from 100 small fires men had learned to keep so that the night would not eat them. It tasted of bread a woman from beyond the wall had made with a knealer's flour and given to a child from Old Town whose name she did not know. It tasted of understanding that is never simple but is always the only thing that keeps the world together when the world wishes to fly apart. He took that taste into him and let it live there. He would need it. He was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and he had invited a king to share a land that none of them could hold alone. He had made enemies out of friends and friends out of enemies and tied them all together with knots the night could not undo quickly. He had built a road between fires, as the Red Woman had asked, and learned that roads are only as good as the feet that walk them. He put his hand on Ghost's neck. The direwolf's coat was warm under his palm, a small fire all its own. Below him, in a yard that had once been only his duty and was now more, men moved and argued and laughed and mended harness and cut kindling and sang. The world did not end. It continued, which is a miracle men learn to call ordinary because they cannot bear to call it otherwise every day. The snow kept falling. The fires kept burning. The wall kept listening. And Jon Snow watched and listened and did not blink.